Okay, so um, this garrison in San Antonio at the old Mission Valero um, is killed on March 6th, and we move on to the next phase of the Texas Revolution. It's amazing how much focus there is on the Alamo, but it is interesting, and it's here. So okay, so Santa Anna makes a big mistake after he captures the Alamo. He doesn't move quickly to move east. And when I'm saying move east, let's just think generally about kind of north of I-10 towards Houston. Um, uh, and the reason that he should have moved quickly is Sam Houston is trying to train at least a portion of the Texas militia. I wouldn't even necessarily call them an army, but he's trying to train them, he's trying to organize them. Um, and if Santa Anna had moved quickly east from San Antonio into the Anglo areas of Texas, remember most Anglos lived in the areas of East Texas where you could grow cotton, right? Very few Anglos lived in San Antonio. Um, if he had moved into the Anglo areas such as the Austin Colony, Santa Ana, Washington on the Brazos, for instance, near Brenham, that probably many of you have gone to as kids, he could have won the Texas Revolution right then and there. But he makes a mistake. He just kind of sits on his ass after the capture of the Alamo. Now, part of this is because his army had been so cut up during the Alamo battle. He'd lost 600 of his best troops. He's still waiting for remnants of his army, elements of his army to consolidate in San Antonio. They're still on the road coming up from the Rio Grande. But a better general would have moved more quickly into the East Texas area, into the Anglo area. And the Texans were just not organized and could have been defeated pretty easily, but Santa Anna is not a very good general. I really can't say that enough. It's not only that he's cruel and mass murder, which is bad enough, but even worse from the point of view of Mexican history, he just was inept. He didn't know what he was doing. Okay, so that's a big mistake. Now, I want to remind you that when the Mexican army comes up into Texas, it comes up in two prongs. The first prong, and I didn't send you this map, and I'm going to promise you I'll send it after I post these lectures. The first of these prongs went through Laredo and the Eagle Pass area. The Mexican army, what it would do, it would find low points in the Rio Grande River where they could cross easily. And so Santa Anna, when he comes up into San Antonio, he comes up with an army of about 4,000 men, ultimately. Now, the second prong came up into Texas from Matamoros, and that's under General Urrea, and that's Urrea, General Urrea, Urrea. Crisp talks about Urrea. One of the things I don't like about the Crisp book, it doesn't have an index, which is a bad thing. But anyway, so General Urrea is coming up from Matamoros with about 2,000 Mexican soldiers, and he's a very different general than Santa Anna. Basically, General Urrea knows what he's doing. He's a professional soldier. He's quite competent, unlike Santa Anna. So as he comes up from Matamoros, Goliad is directly in his sights, right? And there were about 400 Texas defenders, 400 members of the Texas Revolutionary Army at Goliad. What were they doing there? They were the remnants of the Matamoros expedition. Remember, of course, I talked a lot about this. The Texans, after they'd captured San Antonio, marched towards Matamoros. Houston convinces them to turn around. I talked a lot about this in the last podcast. But Houston does let about 400 of his soldiers stay in Goliad because he wants to have a military presence in South Texas. Okay, so that's what those Texas soldiers are doing in Goliad. They're the remnants of the Matamoros expedition. And they're under the command of a guy by the name of James Fannin. Fannin is like many other military leaders. I would say even Travis. He's not very good. He's not a very good general or commander. He wasn't really a general. He's somebody else that had been a slaveholder. He's very, very indecisive. Remember, Fannin was Seguin comes to Goliad and tries to convince Fannin to move to San Antonio to help the defenders of the Alamo, and Fannin kind of messes around. He feints towards San Antonio, but ultimately decides not to go to San Antonio. Very, very frustrating. So he's not very good at what he does. And General Urrea is quite competent. So long story short, there's some fighting between Urrea and Fannin, but Urrea outmaneuvers Fannin. He captures Fannin's army. He captures Fannin's 400 men, and then he marches them back to Goliad. Urrea does as prisoners of war. Okay, so Urrea wins probably the most significant victory of the Mexican army during the Texas Revolution. In an almost bloodless battle, he outmaneuvers Fannin, captures Fannin's troops, and marches them back to Goliad. Now, very importantly, at this point, Urrea moves into East Texas. He's not like Santa Anna. He keeps moving. So after he captures Urrea, after Urrea captures Goliad, he moves up into East Texas in an attempt to capture more Houston's army and the Texas government. So he's not on the scene anymore, and in Goliad, and he leaves some soldiers behind. And this is when the great atrocity of the Texas Revolution occurs. Santa Anna, as you know, because of the Tornell Decree, had decided to kill all the defenders that he ran into or who he captured. And so he ordered the captives, 400 men of Goliad, he ordered them executed. Now, General Urrea did not agree with this order. If he had been on the spot, he probably would not have followed it. He makes his disagreements known, but he's not on the spot. He has moved away from Goliad, and so he doesn't have good communications with Goliad. Long story short, the the officers that are still in Goliad decide they are going to obey Santa Anna's orders. Chris talks about Goliad in two sections of the book. He talks about it in the Ehrenberg chapter, and I think he talks about it in chapter 2. But it's a pretty horrific story. Not pretty, it's horrific. What happens is the Texas defenders don't know what their fate is going to be. They're marched out of Goliad on 3 different roads. Ehrenberg talks about how they're singing. Pena talks about that as well. What they think is going to happen is they think they're going to be marched to ports on the Gulf of Mexico, and they're going to be transported to New Orleans, so that they think they're safe. Okay, but what happens is they march out of Goliad. These 400 men are split up into 3 columns. As they march out on these 3 directions out of Goliad, the Mexican soldiers guarding them turn on them and start killing them. Again, really unbelievably brutal. A classic war crime. I don't care that Santa Anna had issued the Tornell Decree. He's murdering men that had surrendered on a vast scale, over 400 men. Ehrenberg escapes. About 20 others escape in the confusion of this massacre. Fannin himself supposedly was the last person killed, so he could see, the Mexicans were kind of trying to punish him or show him how inept he was, the consequences of his inability to command troops. Horrific story, the murder at Goliad. And at this point, Texans, Anglo-Texans, who, remember, they're mostly in East Texas, right? In the Austin colony. They're in the cotton growing areas. This is where the 30,000 or so, most of them live. They panic, and why wouldn't they panic? The Alamo had been captured. Goliad had been captured. The men at Goliad had been massacred. The Mexican army looks like it's unstoppable. Houston's army is still training, and it looks pretty ragtag. Um, and so you have an incident in Texas history which is called the runaway scrape. And the runaway scrape is this, that Texas civilians made a break they made a break for Louisiana because they knew once they got into Louisiana they'd be safe because that was U.S. territory. Also, Jackson had deployed elements of the U.S. Army along the Texas-Louisiana border. So if these civilians made it to Louisiana, they'd be safe. They'd be protected by the U.S. Army. They'd be in U.S. territory. Now, this was a pretty ugly scene. It was cold. The rivers were high. It was not a pretty sight. This mass retreat of civilians. It's not a story that's often told about Texas history, and kind of it's told in a humorous way. I mean, it's called the runaway scrape, right? Kind of making a joke out of it, but it wasn't a joke at the time, and it wasn't a joke to the people involved. Many of them, they got to Nacogdoches, these civilians, and they just stopped and waited there because they knew that if Santa Anna made a move towards them, that they'd have time to get into Louisiana. So I'll leave you. I'll stop there and begin another podcast.